Thank you, everyone. It's very great to see you all here, and thank you for this opportunity. We promised a lecture, and we're going to deliver a lecture. So it's in two parts. But first of all, I'd like to thank several people for making this event happen. It's been a really wonderful couple of days that we've had down in Centre 42, thinking about and doing dramaturgy. The new media dramaturgy is playing up a little bit, but we'll see how it goes. So first of all, thank you to Charlene Randaran and Yan Lin Ma, and Eugene and Jacqueline at the Centre 42 for organising all of this, both from the back end and from the days that we've been working, that provided a lot of really great material. Thank you also to Asia Dramaturgs Network. It's a really wonderful organisation that I've been kind of connected to tangentially for quite a long time, actually probably since it was founded. And in fact, the last time I was in Singapore was for, I think, the first meeting of that network. So let's move into the lecture. So in this lecture, I will discuss the role of dramaturgy in making contemporary performance. I will explore dramaturgy as an expanded field that includes creative research, writing, devising practices, and social practices that relate arts to activism and community development. I've got a blank slide there, so maybe that's going to help you better. A key question will be how dramaturgy helps to make performances that are creative and aesthetically innovative, while using the medium of theatre itself to make visible our political conditions and to debate the future. So what I'm talking about here is essentially an argument about form, about theatrical forms. So I'm talking about the vocabulary of theatre, not the kind of points that theatre might debate through metaphor or symbolism, but through the existence of bodies, sound, space, design, light, and so on. So this is very fundamental dramaturgical thinking, that we think at the very basis of the vocabulary of theatre, and then we start to think about how those forms themselves construct the meaning of theatre, and how we can think about that in more complex ways, and more interesting ways, and more critical ways. So a key question will be, how does dramaturgy help to make performances that are creative? I've already said that. This question leads to several other questions that are fundamental in and for the performing arts. So these are dramaturgical questions. What can the performing arts do, and what are its limitations? What can dramaturgy bring to questions for performance makers, dramaturgs, and cultural thinkers? And I'm really sort of blurring the distinction between those things. I'm asking theatre makers to think about themselves as cultural thinkers. What can it bring to questions of participation in the arts and to spectatorship and developing an adventurous, supportive, and educated audience? Dramaturg is somebody who has a particular role to play in bridging the production to the audience. And I think that that is an underexplored and often under-resourced task for dramaturgs. We need to take that more seriously. And finally, how does dramaturgy, and by extension contemporary performance, engage us in the ethical, aesthetic, and political questions of our time? So I'm not going to give a history of dramaturgy here. There's much written about that, and there you can read millions of books or look up websites, and that's a kind of, we all, to some degree, I think, understand a certain history of dramaturgy, and we should not spend our time re-going over that old ground of what does dramaturgy mean and all that sort of stuff. Rather, I will try and describe what a dramaturgical practice looks like. This reminds us of a crucial point. So the crucial point is that dramaturgy is thinking through doing. It is active and it is defined by its practices. It's not enough just to write a book about dramaturgy. The actual existence of dramaturgy and its value is identified through practice. Here I'm taking a cue from the late great dramaturg Marianne van Kerkhoven, a name that I will mention several times in this presentation. Marianne was the inventor of the term new dramaturgy, and someone who influenced my own understanding of the practice of dramaturgy. A crucial point for Mariam was that dramaturgy is different for each project. The first question that a dramaturg asks, she says, is what is needed, wanted, or expected for this project in terms of dramaturgy? And what is the need and role for the dramaturg? So in essence, the very notion of dramaturgy that is already a slippery term is always questioned and its contributions are renegotiated. Again, this makes the point that dramaturgy is active and is defined by the practices that are considered to be dramaturgical. It's a really productive point to keep in mind when we're working in the hothouse environment of making performances. What is the requirement? What is the need for this work to be done at this time? At the outset, though, although I'm not going to give you a history of dramaturgy, it might be helpful to have some points of reference for thinking about and doing dramaturgy. And so that we're not all left at sea, these are some of the things about dramaturgy that make sense to me and have informed my work as a dramaturg, and also my work as a researcher on dramaturgy and my thinking about dramaturgy. So, from my own writing, dramaturgy is understood as a transformational, interstitial, and translation practice. I've always talked about dramaturgy as a bridging, a form of bridging ideas and their compositional and embodied enactment. It's a relatively sort of simple phrase, you know, A plus B equals C, but actually the devil is in the detail. It's really about how you then proceed from that point. From Cathy Turner and Sinneberg's landmark text, Dramaturgy and Performance, and if you want to read the definitive text on introducing contemporary dramaturgical practices, this is the one to read. Contemporary views of dramaturgical analysis tend to stress the consideration of the performance as a whole and emphasize that in looking at a work's dramaturgy, we need to consider how all the elements interact. So we're very much talking about what I would say is a kind of form of ecology. It's an ecological practice, and later on I'll relate that to a form of dramaturgy that I have coined the term slow dramaturgy to mean. The third perspective is from Brecht's Lehrstücke. Of course, Bertolt Brecht is a very important person in the invention of dramaturgy. Essentially, the work that he did at the Berliner Ensemble after, you know, when that company was founded in the 1950s, really defined a certain kind of dramaturgical practice. But what I believe that I take from Brecht is that Brecht's model fosters a critical reappraisal of theatre. When we go to the theatre, it is a reasonable expectation that we learn something and see some questions being asked about our world. And those questions, I think, are inherently dramaturgical. So I think we very much take that idea from Brecht that theatre is really a necessary business, but it's going to teach us something. It's going to give us something to think about. It's not just a kind of hapless kind of event. From a wonderful book written by Constantin Georgelou and two other colleagues, we have the statement that dramaturgy attends to the distinct ways through which we activate ourselves, our work, and our communities to produce artwork and at the same time to intervene in the social context. This book was written during the European financial crisis when the National Theatre of Athens was closed because it no longer had a budget, and artists occupied the theatre for a period of time, took over the theatre, and they curated a program of events where the curatorial team was renegotiated every 10 days. So one night you might see a folk performance, a poetry reading, and a dance performance. The next night you'll see a participatory theatre exercise, and so on. And finally, from Van Kerkhoven herself, who wrote that, as I said in the opening slide that we were prefacing this event with, dramaturgy is learning to handle complexity. In a world prone to authoritarian and anti-democratic tendencies, people can easily respond to simplistic viewpoints and infantile democracy. A complex world requires that we re-engage with the idea of complexity. And so we should embrace that idea in dramaturgy and in theatre and in the relationship that theatre has to the world. And instead of looking for sort of simplistic answers to complex questions, Van Kerkhoven would assert that dramaturgy gives us a possibility for thinking about this complex ecology and thinking about the way in which an artistic process itself offers a set of solutions to some real-world events. From these perspectives, we can gain a sense of how dramaturgy is concerned with the creative application of ideas. It is interactive and it is contextual. It expects that theatre will provoke questions, and through the expressive medium of theatre, that it models the need for complex thinking. So it's not a didactic form. I think we've moved past the need for a didactic theatre that simply just hits you over the head with a message and then you go out and have your nice glass of Chardonnay and think, oh, wasn't that awful? It's asking us to model certain kind of practices, both in the way that we make theatre and in the way that we engage theatre with an audience. And that modelling, I would say, is an enlarged process. It's an expanded process that exists beyond simply just the fact that you have a stage and an audience. This is what I mean when I've argued in several texts now that dramaturgy is an expanded field. This is an important idea that I've developed in my own thinking and in my own practice of dramaturgy. The idea that dramaturgy and theatre itself is an expanded field of practice. It's something we began to develop in the work of Not Yet It's Difficult, NYID, the company that I co-founded with David Pledger and Paul Jackson in Melbourne in Australia, where we really developed our own understanding of dramaturgical practices. And it's an interdisciplinary practice that we developed there that is the basis for an expanded field of theatre activities. The first point to note here in this idea of an expanded dramaturgy is that it is a bridging notion. I mentioned this before. I mentioned above, it is not only about how we define a practice in theoretical terms, but it is how we define it through the means of production. So the way we make theatre is the kind of theatre that we get. And the kind of way that we want theatre to speak to an audience and to a community is very much defined not through the genius voice of a playwright or a singular vision, although that's an important aspect of performance, but it's through the way in which the process happens. It's the way in which we support an arts community. It's the way in which artists can come together to make work. It's the way in which that work is allowed to exist and to breathe within a particular theatre culture. The process-driven notion of dramaturgy is a key factor in the rise of contemporary performance. I don't think I need to remind you all that contemporary performance is inherently dramaturgical, because it is very strongly process-driven. You can name pretty much, hundreds of performance groups that have come out in many places around the world, and there's a very strong sense of watching their work and engaging with the theatrical process. When you watch an Okada play, or when you watch forced entertainment, or a Castellucci performance, or a performance by Rosa's company, you see a process enacted, usually to a very high level of clarity and to a very high level of skill. These are companies that are at the top of their game. But very much they're displaying this dramaturgical process to us. One of the ways we engage with and understand this work is through reading the dramaturgy. So we ourselves become dramaturgs in a sense. So a broad field of performance that is often post-dramatic, interdisciplinary and collaborative is representative of this kind of idea of an expanded dramaturgy. This underpins my suggestion in the naming of this lecture that contemporary performance is dramaturgical. One of the ways we define this word contemporary, it's obviously a big term, but one of the ways we define it is in terms of this complexity of its relationship to dramaturgy and the way it makes visible the material properties of theatre on the stage for us to enjoy. The second point on expanded dramaturgy is that it is a concept and a practice. And these distinctions are substantially blurred. What we're asking for, I think, is eventually some kind of way in which the border between theory and practice can be seriously kind of reduced. And we can flow from those two modalities, if you could call them that, much more freely than we do now. Thinking dramaturgy is also doing it, and vice versa. And that has implications not only for how we conceptualize dramaturgy, but also for where we might find the work of dramaturgy being done. Dramaturgy extends beyond the concern with composition and structural aspects in theatre, and it is applied to a diversity of artistic practices and media, as well as social activities and the everyday. Hence, we can talk about the dramaturgy of political campaigns, of sporting events, religious gatherings, concerts, lectures, media campaigns, exhibitions, urban spaces, and so on. The term dramaturgy has been readily appropriated by sociologists and anthropologists, at least since the 1950s in the work of Irving Goffman. So, and they use it to explore the idea of social dramaturgy, how performances in everyday life are enactments and performances, how a performance has an actual transformative power and makes us think differently or behave differently or construct the world in a different way. Moving forward, what if dramaturgs were to work in such non-theatrical settings and apply their craft to these above-mentioned activities? In fact, people working in these mediums are already doing the work of dramaturgy. It would be really important to have dramaturgs who are very skilled and practiced in these areas to be doing that kind of work as well. A call to properly make their labour more visible would bring a more creative and ethical dimension to their work. You know, if we think about social dramaturgy and its possibilities for abuse and misuse in society, in the kind of managerial culture of neoliberalism or the manipulative culture of advertising and media, I think it's really beholden to have dramaturgs in those places who can actually speak back and make those processes of enculturation more visible. Dramaturgs have an important ethical practice in the sense that they ask questions, they open up. They don't close down these practices and make them seamless. They make them visible so that we can understand how, essentially, in the social field, how power operates. In the theatrical field, how creativity operates, and so on. I won't say much more about this point today, but it is a very radical proposition for the future of dramaturgy, that we actually have dramaturgs trained and working in so many of these areas. Finally, though, I underline the point that expanded dramaturgy is important because it changes our understanding of what theatre is and what it can be. At this juncture, we should acknowledge the work of Hans Thiers Lehmann, a scholar and dramaturg who died only 2 weeks ago, and this person who was the author of the book Post-Dramatic Theatre. It was Lehmann's provocation in the co-founding of the dramaturgy program at the Institute for Applied Theatre Studies at the University of Gießen to educate new dramaturgy students to think about dramaturgy not just for the theatre that existed, but one that could exist. This was a very important break with the very academic training of dramaturgs in the German academic system, where there's a whole structure of employment of dramaturgs within major houses and so on. From this, the question of why theatre is foregrounded in dramaturgy. It's not only that Marianne van Kerkhoven says we have to ask what is needed of a dramaturg when we approach a production, but we should also think about the question, well, why would we do the production? Why this, why now? And the implications of this are that the same question should be present in how we make performance and how we come to view it. Theatre has always asked questions about its forms, processes, and relations to audiences. It is often best and most risky when these questions are present in ways that make the theatre both exciting and a little bit like our performance today, teetering on the edge of implosion. Where the artwork embraces a sense of questioning and through a strong sense of aesthetic skill, intelligence, and sensory experience, where it asks us to join in this sense of interrogation. To be engaged in this way wakes us up and invigorates us. And rather than having a tired theatre or a theatre that you sleep through, it really excites us. At the same time as dramaturgy can inspire, though, it also grounds us. And the other side of this coin is that the practice of dramaturgy requires a sense of what is possible. It encapsulates avant-garde or revolutionary thinking, but it also has to happen in a set of existing conditions. The beauty and the tension of dramaturgy and the difficulty or challenge of working as a dramaturg is that it is never only theoretical. It's never only about how many books you've read or how many quotes you can remember from Heine Müller or Bertolt Brecht. But it is also an applied practice. It actually has to be done in the real conditions of making performance, in ways that are meaningful to the production process. It opens the potentials of a creative work through imaginative thinking, while keeping an eye to performance histories, technologies, and everyday practicalities. To this end, each of the following questions are inherently dramaturgical in that they engage with the field of ideas, processes, techniques, and practices. But to answer these questions requires philosophical, aesthetic, and political thinking, but it also requires some very practical answers, some very practical solutions. How do we do this within the particular parameters of a rehearsal process, or within particular budgetary, spatial, contextual relations, and so on? So this list of questions are, in what way can theatre be a critical process, and what is criticism? How does the artist make a bridge from thinking, inspiration, technique into a sustainable and enduring practice? How does performance communicate with audiences? What vocabulary, form, language, sensibility, and so on? What does it mean to represent something? And I think for dramaturgy, this word representation is a really interesting one to consider. My thinking is in the contemporary theatre, we no longer represent things, we present things to an audience. And I'll come back to that point when I look at some case studies. What are the limits of the production? Spatial, economic, ability, time constraints, local conditions for the performance, and local abilities of an audience and the possibilities for the reception of the arts. And while we could debate the complexity of these questions all day, it is probably more helpful to turn to some examples of creative works that can help show some answers, however provisional. And so I'm going to take a short break, and then when I return, I will come back with 3 particular examples of work that I've done as a dramaturg that hope to unpack and provide some possibilities for showing some way forward in the way that we might address these key questions. So our company was set up to establish a kind of diversity of practices that came out of performance, but included media, and also this kind of idea of the translation of the theatre company into an expanded dramaturgy. Just a couple of orientation points. This is some of the perspectives from David, because in that company I was the dramaturg, but David is also a pretty well-known dramaturg himself, and so he has a lot of dramaturgical perspectives. So, in other words, this is what is left for the artist who is in a subaltern position. He says that what is left is process. And process was a very important orientation for the foundation of the company. The idea that process would inform the product is very much a part of our practice, and it informed the kind of dramaturgy that we established and developed, as I'll expand on in a minute. The second perspective is that we consider art to be alchemical, and it changes orders. We really established the company with the idea that the existence of the company, its purpose was to try and intervene and change things. And again, that was very often understood at a dramaturgical level. Fletcher recently published an essay where he talks about the concentric circles of dramaturgy, which is a circular system of independent relationships. And this is something that he's developed in the latest phase of the company's work, which I'm only tangentially involved in, which is a substantial social practice set of activities that the company's involved in, that David is really curating. And we didn't apply a model of dramaturgy. When we founded this company, the word dramaturgy was not well understood. There was certainly no training for dramaturgs in the Australian theatre community. And instead, we developed what we understood to be the dramaturgical practices that we needed and wanted. And they developed over time. We can't say that there is any one dramaturgical project that informed the foundation of NYID. Rather, we had a set of developing and expanding practices that led to, we did about 25 theatre shows over about 15 or 20 years, many of them internationally, some international collaborations. This particular image is from a production of K, which was one of our well-known productions, kind of adaptation of Kafka's The Trial. But the production I want to talk about today as a dramaturgical proposition is the Gekidan Kaitaja NYID Journey to Confusion project. The background to this project was that, as Charlene said in her introduction, I'm a specialist of Japanese contemporary performance. And in my PhD, I first came into contact with this Japanese company, who are a very interesting contemporary performance group who work very strongly with the idea of political bodies. The body is a very politicized, visibly politicized agent in the performance space. Gekidan Kaitaja translates as theatre of deconstruction. So you can see the kind of ways that they're developing their ideas. They actually come out of a history of connections to Buto. Through various means, we ended up hosting them on a visit to Melbourne when they came down to do performances. And I hosted them and we hosted those performances. And we decided that simply hosting them would, we decided to try and make another context for their visit. And at the time we made this work, which was around at the time of the new century, there was a lot of interest in so-called intercultural theatre practice. Ken Sen's work was very visible at the time. Rustam Baracha's critique of Peter Brook's Mahabharata was still very present in the discourse. There were discussions around Minushkin's utilization of Asian theatre practices in her work, and so on and so on and so on. And so there was a discourse of intercultural theatre. There were a lot of artists doing intercultural theatre collaborations. And we were a little bit skeptical of this, and we kind of saw it as a bit of, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. And really there was not a lot of stuff happening beyond that. And you had a lot of situations where artists were working together in residencies and then doing a showing and then not much else. In our case, we did this project over 4 years. So part of what we wanted to do was to theorize the idea of collaboration over time, not just on the kind of clock ticking of a production process funded by an arts council where you have an interaction or a residency for 1 month and then you do something. So we managed to generate various sources of funding for this over time, and we created 3 meetings between the 2 companies. And the first meeting was pretty much a skills sharing exercise. The second meeting was a continuation of that activity and a development of a showing of that work to the members of the performing arts community in Tokyo. And the third was a performance that was commissioned by the Melbourne Next Wave Festival, where we attempted to kind of have our cake and eat its too, and we used the idea of confusion, con-fusion, the idea of having a kind of project that was literally a fusion of bodies from different companies and different practices. But also, we were showing the kind of confusion that was created out of that. These are 2 companies that have very strong basis in a particular set of practices. And as we developed further into the project, the generosity of the actual companies lessened because people became more connected to their practice. And so, in a sense, what we did was we tried to show the difference. So we used that as a basis to think about political bodies against interculturalism. We were doing intercultural theatre in a kind of visible way, but we were also wanting to say, well, don't expect any kind of perfect harmonious solution here, because actually what happens when you do a process is you have a lot of difference. We're informed, and here we have a kind of dramaturgical intervention, by the Lebanese Australian sociologist Ghassan Haj, who at the time was writing really important critical stuff of the Australian political situation, because this is the time when the evil John Howard, the reprehensible Prime Minister of Australia, basically won an election on a kind of highly racialised rejection of refugees kind of narrative. Until that point, refugees had been quite welcome in Australia, and it was one of those flash cultural moments where the right wing saw an opportunity and went for it. And Haj had written very eloquently in a body of work that he called Against Paranoid Nationalism. And so we wanted to sort of use this concept of paranoid nationalism as a way of figuring some of the kind of positioning of the political bodies in the space. The other thing that we did, which is an expanded dramaturgy, is we involved scholars from Australia, Japan, and also a little bit from America. Wan Ling, were you involved in this project? I can't remember. No, but yeah, there were several people involved from the region. And so we had symposia as well as, and so we invited theorists to come and participate in the workshops and the rehearsals. And we also produced a publication. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to give you an idea of the way in which dramaturgy can start out within an actual performance practice and really develop that performance practice coherently and articulately. But it can also lead into these other connections between the academy and performance communities, between scholars and artists from different communities and theatre critics and various people who support this. These photographs, for example, are by Miyoshi Katsu, who's a significant photographer of the Japanese Angora theatre, the contemporary theatre. And he provided these images as a photo essay in the publication. So again, you have this idea of an expanded dramaturgy moving into the visual. And I'll talk more about that in the third example, where we really go to the visual arts. These are just some images from some of the performances that we did. Example 2 is very much more contemporary and connecting to these two concepts, new media dramaturgy and slow dramaturgy, which we've developed extensively in our workshop today or over the last week. New media dramaturgy arose out of a research project that I did with Edward Shear and Lillian Graham. And it was one of those projects that began with an Australian Research Council grant. And so we started within an academic context, and then we theorized the idea of what happens to performance when new media comes into the frame. How does the dramaturgical foundation of that performance change? How do we think about the question of liveness, the question of production, the question of the relationship between the media and the theatrical space? How does it change the experience for the audience and so on? Now, it was dramaturgical because we also worked in practice. We commissioned a number of artists, and this is an interesting point for those of us who write academic research grants. We had a budget line to employ artists as researchers. So we invited the artist, for example, Chris Verdonk, who is the artist who makes very beautiful intermedial work around the question of end times and climate. Here, this image is from Conversations at the End of the World. But we also we invited him to come to Sydney for a workshop with artists in Australia, where we actually debated this through practice. We also displayed artworks. We were able to provide context where artworks around new media dramaturgy that we were highlighting were able to be displayed. And so there was a conversation between the artwork and the production of this new theory. Also, NMD takes its cue from Marion van Kerkhoven. In her work way back in the 1980s and 1990s, she was thinking about the need for dramaturgy itself to think about the possibility of an expanded set of practices. Prior to that, dramaturgs thought in terms of text, or they maybe thought in terms of performance dramaturgy, how is the play unfolding over time? Marion asked us to think about a dramaturgy of spatial relations, of spectatorship, of artistic intention, of aesthetics, and so on. She said, what is a dramaturgy of light? What is a dramaturgy of sound? And so on. So we very much brought that thinking into the production of this project, which included a book, a monograph, but it also included several other publications. And as I mentioned, artistic workshops as well. New media dramaturgy is a framework for both analysing and creating contemporary new media, including multimedia, theatre, dance, video, performance, and installation. And our project also included things like dramaturgies of projection, light, atmosphere, robots, soundscapes, experience, and media playback. And there are new media to draw on in the NMD world, such as VR and streaming and things like that, which are actually things that have come into much more prominence after we wrote this book. So we would now encompass things like VR performance within a new media paradigm. Several young scholars are working on VR performance in really interesting ways, I think. And obviously, in the time of the pandemic, there was a proliferation of the idea of theatre becoming a streaming system or a VR system, or various artists were exploring different ways that theatre became remediated and taken out of this confrontation with a live audience and into a set of other dynamics and possibilities with all sorts of ramifications for performance, to the point where major theatre companies are now having to grapple with the fact that only some of their audience want to go and sit in chairs in front of a live theatre. Many of them are willing to pay sometimes a considerable amount of money to watch something on a streaming service. Now, the purists like myself would say, well, they're not the same thing. But nonetheless, the genie's out of the bottle, and I think it's never going to go back. So we'll have to see how that unfolds. As a dramaturg, though, I worked on a project in the new media dramaturgy environment, which was a film project. And it was also a project about ecology. And so I used it as a way to think about the concept of slow dramaturgy. So this was a project where I was the dramaturg first. There were two works, Phantom Sun and Northern Drift. They both involved a substantial visual presentation. One was in an installation context, and the second one was a film. Both works were conceived and directed by Alexis Dessous, who comes from a visual arts background. These works show the sparsely occupied, uncompromising wilderness of the northern Norwegian-Russian borderland in the European high north. And Dessous's works take the form of investigations whose objects are never quite revealed. He approaches performances in his works as a kind of detective novel. They unfold, they show us kind of possibilities for things that might be happening, but they're also quite mysterious and uncanny. We can relate this to the theory of slow dramaturgy. In an age of ecological crisis, how does theatre and performance respond to the ecological challenges that we face as a planet? It's a serious question that theatre should be asking, much more than it does. We have a lot of capacity, I think, to address this concern because of the fact that we deal with the production of crisis. And we also deal with the production of affect. And we also have a lot of thinking in our work around ideas of the manifestation of plagues and disasters and natural phenomena collapsing and so on and so forth. There's an enormous amount of this work already in theatre. And I think it's beholden to us to think more seriously and more articulately about how we can both revisit that and bring that forward into a contemporary confrontation for society to say, look, if you don't address this, it's really the end times. So, And of course, this is something that is very challenging for everybody. So the key words of this are ecology, extinction, slow, ambient, environmental, the non-human, and the Anthropocene. As I said, I think artists and scholars together have a responsibility to use our work to show this human destruction of the environment and imagine ways to mitigate this. Slow dramaturgy is a theory about or in relation to your or my time, space, and experience of body. Are you living in an environment where species are disappearing? Well, we all are. 50% of the world's species have become extinct in the last 20 years. We all live in that environment. We all contribute to that reality. It does so with a flatter, non-linear sensibility and structure. Slow dramaturgy is ontologically flat. Think about all the performance works now that are a little bit like the ambient music I was playing. They're very, very flat and very slow. And very often, very little happens until there's this moment of explosion or eruption. So it can show breaks and disruptions, fragments, elements of presence and absence. Theatre's very good at showing absence, whether it's Greek theatre and its idea of tragedy and of the fate of the person that cannot be resisted no matter what, or whether it's something like the North Theatre, which is really about absence. It's really very much staging the kind of cosmic experience of absence. It does so in ways that creative feelings, affect, disturbance, and the uncanny become present. Theatre or contemporary performance is really one of the few mediums that really can delve in the question of affect and delve in the question of the uncanny. Not in a kind of Freudian, my mother didn't like me kind of psycho battle. But in the way that the uncanny was always theorized through, its German foundations, which are as something that's unhomely, something that's outside, something that is slightly beyond the horizon but is ready to take over. And it's not about spectacle or noise. This sense of ambience should never be relaxing. Its ambience is a rupture. Theatrically, slow dramaturgy is inspired by Beckett, Brecht for distance, Pinter, Walter Shogo, the great Japanese playwright who died somewhat 20 years ago now, maybe, that was well known for performing these very slow, affective kinds of performances. Carol Churchill, Romeo Castellucci, and Anna and Lawrence Holprin. Philosophically, slow dramaturgy is aligned with the work of Deleuze and Guattari, and to new materialism and eco-criticism in the end times. So bringing slow dramaturgy into the dramaturgical work on Northern Drift was an interesting proposition because it was a challenge for me to work with a visual artist and a filmmaker. Initially, I came onto this project because he wanted to use actors and he wanted somebody to direct the actors. And in the end, we ended up not using the actors. Instead, what we did was we wrote a poetic text which was designed to try and elicit these kinds of slow dramaturgical, flat dramaturgical, uncanny kind of feelings for the audience. And also, we were working with these very powerful images from Alexis. He's a stunning photographer and filmmaker. And so I'll just show you a little bit of this work. This is the film version.
It was a frontier town in a deep water fjord, ready to accommodate large container ships and tankers. A boom-time town in waiting. The director told me the company had tasked him with assessing the needs and implementing the logistics for the industrial development of the High North.
All ships, this is for witness for open navigational warning concerning the area of waters that there is engaged in shelter sound.
archaeologists told me that it was from a time before wealth was privatized. Slowly, it became clear that these remnants were in fact the memory of a time when the common good was meant to prevail. A pretense long since abandoned. She told me some never left.
So 2 or 3 different aspects intersect in this work. One is the fact that this was one of the hot places during the Cold War. On the Russian side, there was a significant town which housed the nuclear submarine base for the Russian fleet. And so this town was, of course, fortified very strongly. And there were a lot of people living up there, and it's still a lot of people living there. But the landscape has changed dramatically because of climate change. So the second thing is that there are many remnants of Cold War enterprises and artifacts, such as the submarine base itself, but also these very dystopian kind of things, such as a drill site called the Super Deep, where during the Cold War the Russians were drilling into the core of the Earth. And they actually drilled the deepest hole that we know exists in the world. They were attempting to drill to the core to, I think, capture the energy there. And that's now capped off. And so we record that in this. At the same time, there's a contemporary context, which is that now climate change has meant that the ice flows in the North Passage have meant that shipping can go through there, thereby saving 4 to 6 weeks of the transport time that it takes to get from Asia to Europe or the United States. And this is a totally unregulated environment at the moment. There's no international authority that is in control of the amount of shipping going through there. And there's very little ability to deal with the possibility of accidents and catastrophe. So just some very nice thoughts to put in your mind. Third example, curating dramaturgies. This is a very quick one. And if the other 2 examples were my work as a dramaturg that touches on certain academic perspectives, this is the way that we come from an academic perspective into dramaturgy. Curating Dramaturgies is a book that I co-edited with my colleague Bertie Ferdman, where we began with the question that live performance is now fully present in visual arts institutions. Visual arts institutions are always using live performance, and we began with the frustration, both as scholars and for me as a practitioner, that they didn't know how to position or install this work. So there's a lot of questions about the way in which the field of performance is being appropriated and turned into something else. There's a lot of questions about what the curators think they're getting. But at the same time, we began with the idea that we should think more about dramaturgy becoming more like curatorship. And inversely, curatorship becoming more like dramaturgy. We can learn a lot from curators. They're very good at positioning work and communicating the meaning of that work to public. At the same time, they need to understand that live performance is not a painting or it's not a sculpture. And very often they don't. They assume that it's going to behave in the same way. And so there is this need, I think now, for some very strong cross-fertilization between these fields. And so in this book, we wrote a kind of keynote essay where we really wanted to explore the provocation of thinking dramaturgically in the context of visual arts, but also thinking, curating curatorially in the practice of dramaturgy. And then we interviewed a whole lot of cultural producers from all over the world working in very diverse contexts, from major cultural institutions, performing arts centres, visual arts institutions such as MoMA, right through to small-scale centres who promote certain contemporary dance or social practice. And then we said, what is your thinking on this question? How do you operate within this field yourself? How do you relate to artists? How do you relate to the performance that you use? And how are you thinking about the framing of this dramaturgically? And so, it's a project that I put out there because it's an example of the way in which people who are working inside the academy, which is very often where dramaturgs work, can still do their work dramaturgically. And I think that it's this dramaturgical thinking that makes visible the ideas and concerns of communities, such as this example of an institutional question. Not at the level of metaphor, As I said at the start, we're not talking about metaphor, we're talking about something that is real, that is tangible, that is put in front of you. But it challenges to think of the ways that theatre can show things, make things visible, as I call it. It makes new forms of knowledge that bring scholarly and artistic worlds. And in making and going to theatre performance or thinking about it, there is more than a field of theory practices that create new knowledge, new experiences, and new ways of being in the world. So I think it's back to the program. Thank you.